This presentation goes over the legal research process. This is a process and steps you can take during your legal research that can help you be a more efficient and a more effective legal researcher. This is the basic legal research process that we're going to look at today. And this is a flow chart going from preliminary analysis to knowledge development, searching for primary sources, updating, and also refining research and analysis, and then stopping the legal research. And the steps again are preliminary analysis, knowledge development, search for primary sources, updating those primary sources, refining your research and analysis, and stopping. And we're going to review each of these steps in more detail. First is preliminary analysis. Always start here. Before you ever open up your computer or open up Westlaw or Lexis or any databases, start with your preliminary analysis. First, read everything you've been given. So if your supervisor gives you a file with all the information they have on a case, go through all of that first. Read everything. If you're in a class and your teacher gives you a file with all of this information, read everything. As you're reading everything, start to identify relevant facts. Also start to identify possible legal issues, as well as your jurisdiction. So you're identifying what you know based on what you've read, but you're also identifying what you don't know. These might be questions that you bring back to your supervisor. These might be questions that you have to research. Also, as you're going through preliminary analysis, start to brainstorm and list out keywords and search terms. These are the words you'll use to search your databases. Think about expanding your research vocabulary. So look at a thesaurus, build out that research vocabulary. Also, during preliminary analysis, this is where you develop your research log and your research plan. A research plan, it can take a variety of forms, and it really can be a personal thing for you. But some of the things you would want to include in a plan are your deadlines. Also, what resources do you have available to you? If you're in a firm, you might only have access to Westlaw. What are the resources on Westlaw that you might use for your particular issue? Your research plan should also include the list of keywords and search terms. So when you continuously look back at your research plan, you can identify which terms you have used and which ones you have not used. And then write out some research steps. How are you going to proceed through this research project? A research log helps you organize your research and helps you remember where you've already looked and where you might not have looked and what you found in those sources. This can help you be very efficient because it reminds you, where have you already looked? Was the source actually helpful? Was it not? You can save time. This is a table format of a basic research log. And the types of information you would include are the date you accessed it, the source citation, and a helpful tip is, if possible, put this citation into the format that you'll need in your final document. So if you need Blue Book formatting for your final document, put this citation into Blue Book format, because when you're writing that final document, then you can just copy and paste from here. It's much quicker. The next column is search queries and terms used to find. So what of those keywords did you use? And how did you find your information? The next column is location and database. So as you'll see, that first source we found through the Atlanta Attorney Law Group blog. The second source was accessed through Westlaw. So if you need to go back to this source, if say you need to go back to Avnet v. Weil on Westlaw, you'll remember you accessed it on Westlaw. The next column is findings and value. What was the value of the source? The first source here gave us a definition. Maybe a source gives you more case law or a citation to a statute. So what is the finding and value? This might also be where you put, there was no value to our issue here. And it's important to include valuable as well as not as valuable sources on your research log. Because as you get into the research process, you're probably going to come across the same sources again. And if you can't remember if you've already looked at it, was it valuable, you can look back at your research log, see that you've already found it, wasn't valuable, you can move on, save time. Your next column is additional sources and keywords identified. You continue to build out your research vocabulary. This is where you might link to other secondary sources, or maybe put a statutory citation here. And then the source date and currentness. This is important because this could identify, are there more relevant sources? So for example, in our second source here, the case is from 1993, and that's a bit old. So we might want to look back and see, is there newer, better case law out there? The next step in our research process is knowledge development. This is where you start to identify and review primary and secondary sources. You start to identify and review possible mandatory and persuasive authorities. And also you start to continue to build out that research vocabulary. You're identifying more keywords, search terms, terms of art. Don't skip knowledge development. It is a very important step. You have to understand your legal issue before you can really dig deep into primary sources. So some tips for knowledge development: make sure you're reading sources and authorities. Don't just find things, read them. And in our technology-driven world, where a lot of our information we just find and we don't actually interact with it, and it can be difficult to remember, oh, I actually have to read this. Another tip is, the less you know about an area of the law, the more time you'll have to spend on knowledge development. And as law students, you're going to spend more time in the knowledge development phase because you don't have that base knowledge. But don't worry, you will get it. And as you become more adept at a particular area of law, more knowledgeable of that particular area of law, your legal research will be quicker. Use a variety of sources. Don't just look at case law. Look at cases, look at statutes, look at regulations, and secondary sources. Secondary sources are your friends. Secondary sources are essential for knowledge development. Don't skip over looking at secondary sources. And lastly, be organized. And this is where the research log comes in. The next step in our research process is search for primary sources. So you've developed your knowledge, you've started to identify some primary sources. This is the step where you find, read, and analyze those primary sources, and then use those primary sources to identify more, and then also find, read, and analyze those primary sources. This is also the step where you're determining, are these primary sources mandatory or persuasive authority? Finding, reading, and analyzing primary sources are the most important parts of the search for primary sources. Finding primary sources should be easier if you've done a lot of knowledge development, because in that knowledge development phase, you've likely found case names, citations, making it easier to find those when you go on things like Westlaw, Lexis, or doing a Google search. The next part is reading. Don't skip this step. You have to be patient and you have to be a careful reader. And make sure you're reading the actual law. What I mean by this is, on Westlaw and Lexis, there are a lot of editorial enhancements, and they make searching for case law, statutes, regulations easier. but they can also sometimes distract us from reading the actual document, from reading the actual case or the statutory language or the regulatory language. So make sure you are actually reading the case, the statute, or the regulation. Don't skip that part. And then analyzing the primary source you're reading against your particular issue. Now our next step in the legal research process is updating. And what we mean by this is asking, is it still good law? So you're checking for negative treatment, and then also checking if the negative treatment is important for your particular issue. So on Westlaw and Lexis, there are a lot of signals that can signal negative treatment. You know, those yellow flags, red flags, the big red stop sign. Those give you a little bit of information on potential negative treatment, but you still have to make sure that that negative treatment actually is important for your issue. As we know, cases often have multiple issues at play in them. So the negative treatment might be for a completely other issue that has nothing to do with your particular problem. Updating also involves identifying future developments. So this is looking ahead. And this is especially important to use secondary sources for this, to identify maybe there's a case that's going up through the courts that would negatively impact your issue. Maybe the legislature has proposed legislation that would amend the statute that you're depending on. So looking ahead, what's happening in the future is very important for the updating process. And then the next step is refine research and analysis. This is a place where you look at more secondary sources, consult other people, ask your supervisor, ask a librarian or other information professional. Say, this is what I have found, this is what I think, can you help me? Where haven't I looked? What have I missed? Review your research log, review your research plan before you ever turn anything into a supervisor or a professor. Make sure you've reviewed your research plan and your research log and you've done everything you said you were going to do. And then always incorporate new information into your legal analysis. So tips on refining research and analysis. The top one is ask for help. Ask your supervisor, ask an information professional, a librarian. Make sure that you've looked at all the resources that you have available. Make sure you've covered all your bases. And this is where asking for help can be very important. There's two main issues when you're refining your research and analysis. One is maybe you're getting too many or irrelevant search results. You might have to narrow your searches using filters and advanced search techniques, and also identify and use different keywords in search terms. The other issue is getting too few relevant research results, so you might have to broaden your searches and also use a variety of sources and search terms. The most difficult part of the research process is knowing when to stop. It's important to realize that there might not be a clear on-point answer. In legal research, we have to be comfortable with finding the negative, meaning sometimes the fact that there is no answer is the answer. So when you're thinking about when do you stop, review your research plan and your deadlines, and also ask for help. This is where asking a supervisor, asking an information professional, librarian, their thoughts on whether you've covered all your bases. And some things that help you determine when to stop is you begin to find the same cases, statutes, and regulations over and over again. Another important thing in determining when to stop is cost-benefit analysis. So the cost of continuing to research might outweigh the potential economic benefit. And what I mean by this is, say, if you spend $10,000 researching a case in which the client can only receive $5,000, that's not using your time effectively. This is an area that when you get out into the real world of legal work in a firm and general counsel's office, you'll be able to gauge this much better than you can in law school. This is an area where it's really difficult to replicate this cost-benefit analysis, but it's something you should keep in mind. And then especially helping you determine when to stop, your deadlines. When are things due? That will definitely help you know when to stop. So again, this is our basic legal research process. We're doing preliminary analysis, knowledge development, searching for primary sources, updating those primary sources to make sure they're still good law, refining our research and analysis, and then eventually stopping. And this is a nice, tidy, neat legal research process. Of course, we have to remember that legal research isn't always a linear process. The order in which the steps are taken might vary depending on different factors, such as the information you know at the outset of the project, the information that is discovered during the research process, the scope of the project. You might only be working on one particular area of a larger project. And also you may need to return or repeat steps in the legal research process before your research is complete. For example, you might get to updating primary sources and realize you don't know enough about this issue, and you'll have to return to the knowledge development phase and return to those secondary sources. So this is a very general overview of the legal research process. Following a process can help you become a more efficient and effective legal researcher.